Hello my friends, welcome to another video at the Lulu Blue Studio. Today we are going to paint this flower composition and we are going to mainly focus on understanding how to paint the white flowers in watercolor. As you probably know, watercolor is a sort of technique where we don't use white paint because we take advantage of the white of the paper to create, for example, white flowers. So how can we achieve this? There are several techniques and today I'm going to explain you my favorite ones. My favorite one is actually to use a gray pigment. A gray color, this is for example a gray pigment that I have from a travel tin, and this color is called Davis Gray from Winsor & Newton. So my first recommendation is actually to use a gray pigment, a gray color, and you can use it as diluted or concentrated depending on the amount of water you're using in order to achieve different effects. So this is my favorite way of achieving white flowers in watercolor. Although in this moment this gray pigment looks a little bit concentrated, you will notice that by the time this flower composition is going to be completely dry, this gray will not be as concentrated as it looks like. For this reason, what I recommend you is to use such a gray pigment and create all of your flowers in different concentrations. This means using different percentages of pigment and amounts of water in order to create different color values and create the shape of your flowers as you wish. Since gray pigments are usually quite light, I recommend you to add, for example, in the center of the flowers, a little bit of, in this case, I've added a little bit of yellow, lemon yellow from Schminke. And I recommend you to add this kick of color in order to highlight, let's say, the shape of your flowers. So my first recommendation for you on how to paint a white flower is exactly this one. To use a gray pigment such as Davis Gray from Winsor & Newton to create the overall shape of your flowers and then add a little bit of hints of colors. It can be yellow, it can be purple to the center, for example, of your flowers in order to highlight the shape of your flowers. You will notice when the composition is going to be completely dry that the effect that this gray color leaves on the paper is really beautiful. Another way to create white flowers in watercolor is to use the black pigment. For example, in my color palette, I have the black Mars Black from Winsor & Newton. And my second recommendation for you would be to use this pigment, Black Mars, very diluted. It means just a little bit amount of Black Mars with a higher concentration of water, and lay onto the paper this mixture of black and water. This was a technique that I used often in the past, but I think is a little bit challenging to achieve the perfect ratio between black and water that creates a flower that looks quite white and doesn't look too dark, and also using a percentage, an amount of water that is perfectly behaving with the paper underneath. So my second recommendation would be to use the black pigment such as Mars Black from Winsor & Newton, diluted with a little bit of water, and try to use this concentration to create your flowers. As I said, I find this technique a little bit more challenging than using just the gray pigment. Therefore, it's not my favorite way to go to create the white pigment or the impression that the flowers are going to be white. And between these two techniques, I still prefer the first one, that is to use a gray pigment such as Davis Gray. Another way to create white flowers is actually to use a very light concentration of any color that you have on your color palette. For example, you can use a very light concentration of pink or a very light concentration of yellow or red that you have on your color palette, and just create these flowers on the paper, taking advantage of the low concentration of pigment and high concentration of water. This is a perfect technique, and I think I prefer it compared to using just black, because it still gives the impression that these flowers are white, are very light in color. But I still think that for beginners this technique could be a little bit challenging, because it can be a little bit difficult to understand what is the perfect ratio between water and a very light pigment to create these colors. Therefore, I still suggest you to use, if you have available on your palette, a little bit of gray paint and create your flowers using this gray paint, and maybe adding a few touches of colors through the wet in wet technique. For this flower composition, I started as a first step to create the white flowers in the center of the paper. I used, as I said, this Davis Gray paint. I've added a little bit of yellow paint that was lemon yellow from Schminke, and I've given these main big flowers the shape, a loose shape that reminds a little bit of open peonies. I then decided to frame these white flowers with some colored leaves and red flowers. So what I started to create first was some sort of roses, loose style roses, mixing a little bit of Scarlet Lake and transparent orange. I've then added loose style leaves, always using my round brush in size 12. And I took advantage of the many greens that I have on my color palette to create different color hues and color values. In this way, all the leaves are framing the white flowers, and the white flowers are sort of being highlighted, and they are coming alive from the paper underneath. When I usually paint white flowers and I want them to be the center part of the composition, I like then to frame the flowers with very colorful elements like leaves and other flowers, filling flowers or other smaller flowers all around the page. I'd like the observer to start looking at this flower composition from the top right corner of the page, and following an S shape, look at the composition until the lower left corner of the page. It is for this reason that I'm adding 3 roses in the lower left corner of this page. I will then proceed using different greens on my color palette and this round brush to create loose style leaves that start from the upper right corner of the page and lead the eyes of the observer down to the left corner in the bottom part of the page. This flower composition is quite heavy in leaves, and in order to achieve a nice effect, I keep in mind to change the color hue, that means the color of the leaves that I am creating. And so I create different mixtures of Sap Green and Green Earth. And I also remember to use different amounts of water in order to change the color value. Some leaves are going to be more concentrated and some leaves are going to be much lighter with a higher amount of water. I like to frame the white flowers with all of these green leaves, and I really think that this effect helps the observer to see that there are these white big flowers, open flowers in the center part of the composition. And I encourage you, if you are painting white flowers, to remember to frame them with bright colors or anyway with other colors left and right in order to let them pop. When I finish to create the base of the leaves, where I am using mainly Sap Green, a little bit of Green Earth, and mainly different color values of these mixtures, I start to create a few highlighted leaves that are darker in colors, mainly using some Cobalt Green Dark, which is a dark shade of green from Schminke, which I use as it is, or I mix it with a little bit of red to create a sort of muted dark green that creates leaves that pop from the high amount of leaves that I've laid as a first layer. To create these leaves, I'm using a smaller brush. This is a round brush in size 6. And I'm using a smaller brush because I want these leaves to be a little bit smaller and just to grab the eye of the observer, but I don't want these leaves to be too heavy in the composition overall. I think these darker leaves also help to frame these white flowers, and therefore I take advantage of using this technique to keep adding details to all the leaves and to the whole composition overall. I take a little bit of yellow ochre and I start to add the center of these flowers. I mix it with a little bit of burnt umber, and I created the center of the flowers using just the fine tip of this brush, this round brush. I create a little bit of dots, sort of dots, and some straight lines that start from the center of the flower. And as I'm creating the center of both flowers, I'd like to highlight what are my main 3 tips for you to create white flowers. The first tip, and my favorite tip, is to use a gray paint such as Davis Gray to create your white flowers. Remember that this gray paint is not going to be very concentrated, so you can add a few brush strokes of more concentrated colors such as yellow or red in the center of your flowers to give the effect that these white petals are sort of popping from the page. My second tip for you is to use a very light amount of black, such as Mars Black, and dilute it with your water and create a watercolor layer that is very, very light in black and gives the effect that the petals of your flowers are actually white. My third tip for you is to use any color that you have on your color palette and use the same technique of diluting any color you have on your color palette with a higher percentage of water. You can lay then onto your paper brush strokes that are the petals of your flowers, and the effect is going to be very, very nice. I hope you found this tutorial useful. If so, let me know in the comments below. See you in the next video.